Yo, what's going on, YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte, and today we are taking a look back in time. We're going back in the time machine again here as we take a look back at the oil change era of the Edmonton Oilers. Now, the Edmonton oil change series, it's actually, you could watch it on YouTube. I always go through that. It is basically from the 2010 NHL draft up until, I think they did it till like 2015, 2014, something like that. It went for a pretty long time. And the oil change was basically the Oilers' attempt when they were rebuilding the organization from the bottom up. And unfortunately, it didn't really work. You look throughout most of the series of the oil change documentary, from what they said in the beginning, how they had been getting mocked, and they actually had Kevin Lowe on in the first episode talking about how he should have held out on Chris Pronger and this and that. And you look at some of the trades the Oilers have made. Now, I know this isn't like me attacking the Oilers organization, obviously not, but you look at some of these moves that the Oilers made, and the fact that the first overall picks they had and all of this, just because you have all that doesn't necessarily lead to success. You could have 10 straight first overall picks and you still don't end up being that great team. And this, unfortunately, is the closest example to that. So we'll be going over that today. So, like I said, it started, we're going to go back even further than the oil change documentary. We're going back to the 2005-2006 NHL season. And if you guys remember, even before that, their Stanley Cup championships, they won in back-to-back years from taking over from the Islanders dynasty in the 80s. They won cups in 1984, 1985, 1987, and winning again in 1990. That was 4 Stanley Cups. They had 2 Stanley Cup Final appearances after that period in the 90s. They were a fairly successful team. They had 6 Hall of Famers during that time, which we all know the greats of the Oilers era. Obviously, Wayne Gretzky, Mark Messier, Paul Coffey, all of those guys, right? That was a huge part of the Oilers' success. So now we go up to the 2005-2006 season, where they had gone to the Stanley Cup Finals. They had a pretty impressive year. They finished with 95 points that season, and it was a pretty successful year for the Oilers. They lost in Game 7 to the Carolina Hurricanes, who ultimately won the Stanley Cup that year. And ever since then, you could argue that the Oilers were a victim of their success at that point. That was a point where the Oilers thought they were so close to winning the Stanley Cup, and they had all these fans, all trying to sell season tickets for the following year. And Kevin Lowe said, how do you rebuild the team and sell that to the fans when you just went to the Stanley Cup Finals the year prior? And that was tough. That was really tough for the Oilers because they didn't fully commit to the rebuild at that point when they knew that they should have. And you look at that 2005-06 season and you think, well, that means in 2007, maybe the Oilers have a chance to get back there again. And it doesn't work like that. So the first thing that happened after losing in the Stanley Cup Final in Game 7 of 2006, the day before 4th of July, July 3rd, 2006, the Edmonton Oilers made a massive trade. Now, remember, this is during the Kevin Lowe era of the Oilers. He was there from 2000 until 2008. Chris Pronger had been traded to the Anaheim Ducks. He wanted out of Edmonton, and the Oilers probably didn't get the value for Pronger that they should have. I mean, we all know how good Chris Pronger was. One of the best defensemen, not only in hockey in his generation, in NHL history. Chris Pronger was that good of a defenseman, but he got bounced around a lot. The Oilers weren't the only team to trade him and not really get the value that they should have. I mean, you look at the St. Louis Blues did something similar, the Flyers, the Oilers, right? So this is not the only team to have made a bad move with Chris Pronger, but that was the start of how things kind of led up to where we are today. So now we go to the 2006 NHL draft, And it's a name that we know today in the NHL. Second round pick, Jeff Petrie. Now, we're going to talk about him later on, but Jeff Petrie of the Edmonton Oilers. That was the first player that we're starting off with here in the draft. Jeff Petrie. Now, we get into the 2006-2007 NHL season, and it was an utter disaster for the Edmonton Oilers. So, following up that season prior where they went to were the Western, quote-unquote, Western Conference champions, whatever you want to call it, they went to the Stanley Cup Final. They had 71 points the season after that. That is a 24-point dip from what they had the season prior. That is really, really bad. The Oilers had fallen off, and this was to be expected with some of the things that were happening, and obviously losing Chris Pronger being a huge piece of that. So that spring, come the trade deadline, they traded Ryan Smith to the New York Islanders. He was a leader in the locker room, a great guy around the Oilers organization, and they had traded him out. Now, this ended up being a benefit for the Edmonton Oilers as a guy that was not going to possibly return, but that was something they could look at in the offseason. The Islanders were willing to give up assets for him, and they ended up doing pretty well with that trade. So now we get to the 2007 NHL Draft, and that is where they had the 6th overall pick, selecting Sam Gagner. And we're going to hear his name a lot throughout this video. They also took, in the first round, they had 3 first-round picks, the second being Alex Plante, who was a part of that Ryan Smith trade from the Islanders at the deadline. And they also picked up, with the 21st pick, Riley Nash. Again, a name we're going to hear later on. They also selected, in the 4th round, a pretty good defenseman from Sweden, Linus Ullmark. So just keep those names in the back of your mind and just kind of just to keep a refresher there. So now we get into the 2007-2008 NHL season, where the Edmonton Oilers actually did pretty well. They had 88 points that season, and they actually drafted fairly low. Now, they ended up drafting in the first round that year, in 2008. They drafted the 22nd overall pick. That was the Los Angeles Kings draft pick they got earlier that year. That ended up being Jordan Eberle, who was one of the guys they were going to build this Edmonton Oilers team around. So Jordan Eberle now in the fold. So now you look at some of these draft picks. You have guys like Jeff Petrie, Linus Ullmark on the back end. Up front, Sam Gagner, Jordan Eberle, right? So now we get to the 2008-2009 season, and the summer of 2008, the Edmonton Oilers fire general manager Kevin Lowe. Kevin Lowe is out of the organization, and Steve Tambellini is the next general manager of the Edmonton Oilers. So the Edmonton Oilers have a pretty solid season again, but they were technically worse than the season prior. They only had 85 points that season, so they technically took a dip from the season prior under their new general manager. And then they get to the 2009 NHL Draft. And this is kind of where that oil change documentary comes in, because they did mention the 2009 draft, the first year under Steve Tambellini. And in that draft, with the first round pick, the 10th overall selection, they take Magnus Paajarvi Svensson, and they take him with their 10th overall draft pick. So now you see they're building up the cupboard with draft picks in the first round. Magnus Paajarvi Svensson, Jordan Eberle, Riley Nash, Sam Gagner, and then some of those defensemen, like I've been saying, Linus Ullmark, Jeff Petrie. So now we get to where things really went downhill for the Edmonton Oilers. So after 2 seasons with 85 plus points, the 2009-2010 campaign was a real low point for the Oilers. But this was the year where the Oilers said, from Daryl Cates, we are committing to a full rebuild in Edmonton. Hence, the code name, the oil change, right? So now the oil change is officially in effect. They're draining the organization of veterans and depth guys in order to acquire more draft picks, prospects, and young players for them to rebuild the organization. In that 2009-2010 season, the Oilers had hit an all-time low for their 2000s. They had hit 62 points, which was the lowest that the Oilers had hit in a very long time. And the Oilers were one of the worst organizations in the NHL that season. It was a dead season before it even started for the Oilers. They had multiple injuries. Some of their young guys that were in the organization, we're starting to see guys like Sam Gagner, Jeff Petrie, Linus Ullmark. We started seeing guys like Sean Horkoff getting injured throughout the season, and these were their guys that they were relying on, and it ended up being a really bad season. Like I said, 62 points. But the bright side of that was the Edmonton Oilers in 2010, for the first time in franchise history, would be getting the first overall draft pick, and that tended to be a theme for the Oilers moving forward. They got the first overall pick due to their lackluster season, drafting with the first overall pick, Taylor Hall. There was a lot of debate at that 2010 NHL draft. Who would the Oilers select? There was Tyler Seguin, the centerman, the playmaking center, but would he fit in with the Oilers organization? They end up taking the winger, which in today's NHL, you go back, most teams probably would have taken the center Seguin, yet the Oilers go with the winger, the guy that did very well in his junior season. They go with Taylor Hall with their first overall pick. They did have a couple of guys that would lead to part of their core moving forward in the second round. They had a couple of second-round selections, taking Tyler Pitlick and Martin Marincin, who those names probably sound familiar because they're still kicking around a little bit in the NHL today here in 2022. Now we get to the 2010-2011 NHL season, and it was another lackluster season for the Oilers, but we see another pretty big trade here involving the Anaheim Ducks and the Edmonton Oilers. So at the trade deadline, the Edmonton Oilers send Dustin Penner to the Los Angeles Kings for Colton Tubert, who was a former first-round pick back in the day for the Chicago Blackhawks, and a draft pick, which ended up becoming this guy that probably sounds familiar to Oilers fans, Oscar Klefbom. And that was at the deadline in 2011. And the Oilers would once again finish with the same exact amount of points to the season prior, 62 points. So 2 straight seasons with 62 points. Definitely tough to see the Oilers during this stretch. This was really the low points of the oil change in Edmonton. And they finished with 62 points that year. Once again, with the best odds at the first overall pick in the 2011 NHL draft. In that 2011 NHL draft, they won the lottery once again, getting 2 first overall picks in consecutive seasons. They selected Taylor Hall with the first of those, and they took the centerman in this draft, taking centerman Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, playing right down the road in Western Canada in the WHL with the Red Deer Rebels. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins was the next face of the franchise down the middle, alongside his teammate Taylor Hall. They also picked with the later on in that first round, taking with the 19th overall selection, a defenseman we still know today in Edmonton, taking defenseman Oscar Klefbom. So now you look at their prospect pool. They're developing a pretty good prospect pool. Up front, now you've added to the equation, you have Sam Gagner, Alex Plant, Riley Nash, Jordan Eberle, Magnus Paajarvi-Svensson, Taylor Hall, Tyler Pitlick, and now you've also got Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. And now you look on the back end. The back end's looking pretty good. You've got Jeff Petrie, Linus Ullmark, Martin Marincin, Colton Tubert, as well as Oscar Klefbom. Now things got slightly better in the 2011-2012 season, but the Oilers were going to miss the playoffs once again. And this was, again, at this point, since 2006, since they made the playoffs. This is now 6 straight seasons that the Oilers have missed the playoffs. They get 74 points that season in the 2011-12 season. And that summer, in July 12th of 2011, the Anaheim Ducks again come up on the radar in a trade. They trade Andrew Cogliano to the Anaheim Ducks for a couple of depth players and draft picks once again. So now we get to the 2012 NHL draft, and as the Oilers continue to hemorrhage off, older players and veterans, they bring in more young talent. And for the 3rd consecutive year, the Edmonton Oilers in the 2012 NHL draft have the first overall pick once again. And there wasn't much debate in this one. There was a kid in Russia, big Russian sniper, Nail Yakupov, who was supposed to be, again, another superstar talent coming into the Oilers organization. So now the Oilers have a first line of first overall draft picks. You have the left winger, Taylor Hall. You have Ryan Nugent-Hopkins down the middle as your center, and now Yakupov as your right winger. So the Oilers had built an entire first line of first overall picks in 3 consecutive seasons. In the second round, they took a guy that's still kicking around today, Jujhar Khaira, and they also selected in the 4th round, Eric Gustafsson, who is a defenseman who is still in the NHL today. Both of those guys, fittingly, playing with the Chicago Blackhawks. So now, you're looking at the prospect pool here. It is pretty incredible what the Oilers have done here in this little oil change up to 2012. You have an entire first line of Yakupov, Nugent-Hopkins, and Taylor Hall. You also have some depth wingers. You've got Tyler Pitlick, Magnus Pajärvi-Svensson, Jordan Eberle, Sam Gagner, and like I said, on the blue line, you have all those guys that we've been talking about throughout the video. Now, the 2012-2013 season was much improved for the Edmonton Oilers. Now, it doesn't show it in terms of points, but in a 48-game season and a lockout-shortened season, the Oilers finished 3rd in the Northwestern Division with 45 points in 48 games. A much improved Edmonton Oilers team from what we had seen in the years prior, which would have probably landed them between 75 to 80 points that season. But again, they finished 3rd in the division. Unfortunately, though, they would still miss the playoffs for now the 8th consecutive season. A really tough spot here for the Edmonton Oilers. Well, 7th consecutive season. Now, the only real thing that the Oilers had done in March, again, another trade deadline move, the Edmonton Oilers send out Tobias Rieder, who was a 4th-round pick a couple of years back, to the Arizona Coyotes for another depth draft pick. You're seeing another guy that ended up becoming a decent middle six player for the Oilers, and quite fittingly enough, he actually came back to the Oilers a few seasons later. But Toby Rieder, a member of the Arizona Coyotes. Now, again, another season that there was improvement from the Oilers, but they missed the playoffs again. Daryl Katz and the ownership make a huge decision, firing Steve Tambellini as the general manager of the Edmonton Oilers. They bring in Craig McTavish, a former player in the NHL, a defenseman. He played with, I believe, the St. Louis Blues, the Edmonton Oilers. So Craig McTavish is coming in for 2013, and this is a big one for the Oilers. Now we get to see some more names that you've heard of in recent memory for the Oilers. Their 7th overall pick, so again, they're drafting in the top 10 for a 4th consecutive season, selecting Darnell Nurse, the defenseman, with the 7th pick. They also took in the 3rd round Anton Slepyshev to add some more depth to their forward group. But 2013-2014 hits. And it's the same old story for the Edmonton Oilers. They finished the season with 67 points and a lackluster season, to say the least. But there was a lot of changes after that first season with their new general manager, Craig McTavish. So 4th of July on 2013, they made a pretty big change in the locker room, sending out Sean Horkoff to the Dallas Stars for draft picks and prospects. A week later, they had acquired from the St. Louis Blues forward David Perron to add some depth. They also traded later on that winter Linus Ullmark, who was a guy that they had drafted, hoping he would become a top 4 defenseman. Linus Ullmark traded to the Buffalo Sabres after not really getting a great start. He had been playing a lot in Oklahoma City with the Oklahoma City Oilers. He had finally had his wits end, requested a trade out of Edmonton, and ultimately played, I think, 30 games with the Buffalo Sabres, and he ended up going to Europe. And that is where Linus Ullmark is today, and that was the end of Linus Ullmark with the Oilers. Then we started to see in the beginning of 2014, Craig McTavish was not done making moves. He made a couple of pretty big wholesale changes to the goaltending, trading out Devin Dubnyk and bringing in Matt Hendricks in the deal. Devin Dubnyk, for Matt Hendricks. Yeah, so they traded out Devin Dubnyk, who is supposed to be a starting goaltender in the NHL. He wanted out of Edmonton. He ultimately got his wish going to Nashville. And then we saw them on the same day acquiring Ben Scrivens from the Los Angeles Kings. Ben Scrivens was a guy that was kind of looking like a decent backup that may get a shot at a starter position. He got that in 2014 with the Oilers. So it was a complete, just a flop between Dubnyk for Scrivens. Then in March of 2014, around the trade deadline, they traded Universe Man. They traded Ilya Bryzgalov to the Minnesota Wild, and they acquired Victor Fost from the Anaheim Ducks. He was a starter in Anaheim, but there were some questions about him overall, so the Ducks decided to trade Victor Fost out and send him to Edmonton. That project did not work. So in the span of just a couple of months in 2014, they had traded out Devan Dubnyk and Ilya Bryzgalov, which was their tandem, in order to bring in Ben Scrivens and Victor Fost in order to replace them. That wasn't it, though. A day later in 2014, in March of 2014, once again, they trade Aleš Hemsky to the Ottawa Senators. Again, another guy, along with Horkoff and Perron, that they were trying to build that group around. Aleš Hemsky gets traded out. Didn't sound like he wanted to re-sign in the summer of 2014. So they sent him out as a rental to the Ottawa Senators. Now we get to the summer of 2014, another pretty big draft for the Edmonton Oilers. As for the fourth time in 5 seasons, they are selecting in the top 3. They take Leon Draisaitl, the centerman from Cologne, Germany, as their 3rd overall draft pick. And now you're starting to hear the names. Oh, these guys sound more familiar, right? So now we get to the 2014-2015 NHL season for the Edmonton Oilers, and there's a lot of promise. You have a couple of good prospects coming in. There's a Leon Draisaitl guy who should be coming in a couple of years from Europe. And it's the same old story once again. The Edmonton Oilers have another rough season. They actually did worse this season, only acquiring 62 points that season, actually falling 5 points from the season prior. And it was another season of changes for the Edmonton Oilers and would ultimately lead to another shakeup in management once again. And this is kind of where the oil change series kind of concludes, because I think they realized this isn't working. Every guy that keeps coming in here, this is just a soap opera at this point. And some of the conversations they had in those trade deadline rooms up in Edmonton and stuff, it got to the point where it's like, all right, this is more embarrassing than it's worth. We need to cut this loose. So now we get to that season, like I said, 62 points. If you're keeping track, we're now in 2015. This is now 9 straight seasons that the Edmonton Oilers have missed the Stanley Cup playoffs. And in the summer of 2014, they trade out long-tenured first round pick of the Oilers, Sam Gagner, to the Tampa Bay Lightning in exchange for veteran Teddy Purcell. Teddy Purcell was a really good player for the Tampa Bay Lightning and was a good depth player. I think he enjoyed playing in Tampa Bay, and he gets moved to Edmonton, which is pretty much the biggest FU at that time, because you knew 9 straight seasons of missed playoffs, 3 or 4 different managers at this point. It was rough, and it was hard for the Oilers to bring in guys because they saw, it's basically, what have you shown for me recently? 9 straight seasons of missing the playoffs. You haven't gotten 80-plus points now in 4 or 5 years. What am I coming into here, right? And all they could sell was hope of the future. We saw another trade in January of 2015. They traded David Perron to the Pittsburgh Penguins, and the Penguins are a team to keep an eye on here. They traded David Perron to the Pittsburgh Penguins with Ray Shero in a deal for Rob Klinkhammer and a 2015 first-round pick. And we need to keep an eye on that 2015 first-round pick from Pittsburgh, because there's more to the story there, and we'll get there. Because the 2015 NHL draft was a big one for the Oilers. And they also traded Jeff Petrie to the Montreal Canadiens. Again, one of those early draft picks, that 2006 second-round pick. Jeff Petrie goes to the Montreal Canadiens for a second-round pick and a fifth-round pick. So they get slightly better assets in return. And that was the last deal we would see for Craig McTavish with the Edmonton Oilers. Peter Chiarelli was the next guy to come into Edmonton in the draft time of 2015, as the season had not gone well. And at the end of another lackluster season with 62 points, we see Peter Chiarelli, who in 2011, just 4 seasons prior, had won the Stanley Cup with the Boston Bruins. There was some hype around the new general manager in Edmonton, Peter Chiarelli. But he had been making some questionable moves in that 4-year span in his time in Boston. And part of the reason the Bruins kind of let him go, the Tyler Seguin trade, and a couple of other ones that really made you wonder what's going on with Peter Chiarelli. Well, the 2015-2016 season, we can't get there quite yet because we have to get to the 2015 draft. And Peter Chiarelli had sold to ownership, Daryl Cates, and everybody else there that he was looking to get a team that could make the playoffs now. And that was one of the key things for Peter Chiarelli, and he was going to have a pretty good way of doing that, as he was going to once again have the first overall pick in the 2015 NHL draft. Now, the 2015 NHL draft is a peculiar one for the Oilers, where they had a lot of highs and a lot of lows in this draft class. As you look, they have the first overall pick, beating Buffalo for the next generation of the NHL, being Connor McDavid from the OHL's Erie Otters. And that was a pretty big pick for the Oilers, so they could build around Connor McDavid. They just drafted Leon Draisaitl with the third pick just a year prior. They still had those 3 consecutive first overall picks in Yakupov, Hall, Nugent Hopkins. They also had Eberle still. They had a couple of really good players in the organization's pipeline. So they drafted with the first overall pick, Connor McDavid. Now, there was still more to the story after that. So they draft Connor McDavid in the first day, right? That was the first thing they did. But then with that 15th overall pick, I mentioned they traded out David Perron for the 15th overall pick, right, from the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now that Pittsburgh Penguins pick went to the Oilers, and the Oilers ended up trading that pick. The Islanders, all of a sudden, are in talks with Peter Chiarelli. Now, there was a lot of talk throughout their exchanges between Garth Snow and Peter Chiarelli. They had talked for a little while here, as you're going to see, making moves. But with that 15th pick, all of a sudden, you see trade alert before the Oilers' time runs out. Gary Bettman comes up to the podium and says, "We have a trade." The New York Islanders trade defenseman Griffin Reinhart, who had formerly played in the WHL with the Edmonton Oil Kings in the WHL. He was a very good defenseman there. I think he won Defenseman of the Year in the WHL in the 2008-2010 NHL draft of the Islanders. The Edmonton Oilers acquire Griffin Reinhart. In exchange, the Oilers give up the 2015 first-round pick, which was the 15th overall pick, and a 2015 second-round pick, which ended up going to the Tampa Bay Lightning. We'll get to that later. That ended up becoming Matthew Spencer. But the Islanders had later traded that second-round pick to get another draft pick in the later part of this round that actually ended up becoming Anthony Beauvillier for the Islanders. So the Islanders got the 15th overall pick and eventually Anthony Beauvillier later on in this draft. And the Islanders, with that 15th selection, ended up drafting none other than Matthew Barzal, and we know the story about that. If you go back to my video just last week, 2015 NHL draft, I take a look back at that draft and how the Oilers had kind of botched things up with that Barzal pick, bringing in Reinhart, who unfortunately had only played 29 games in his 2 seasons with the Oilers. He played one 29-game season with the Oilers, and that next season he had played in Oklahoma City, where he inevitably went to Bakersfield and actually became expansion to the Vegas Golden Knights in 2018. So he never really got going, and that was a tough trade there for the Oilers. But it wasn't all bad for the Oilers. They also brought in Cam Talbot to be the next starter in Edmonton. They made a trade on day 2 of the draft. They traded in Cam Talbot from the New York Rangers for a 2015 second, a 2015 third, and a 2015 7th round pick. So a second, a third, and a 7th in 2015 to the New York Rangers for Cam Talbot. Now, I know Rangers fans were disappointed. They really wanted a first round pick for Cam Talbot, and so did the Rangers staff, but they were not able to get that from the Oilers. He ended up playing 4 years in Edmonton with the Oilers, was on the successful 2016-17 team, which we'll get to in a minute. But Cam Talbot he paid his dues for this team. And that second day at the draft was actually pretty good for the Oilers. They took Caleb Jones in the 4th round, who actually was pretty good. Ethan Bear in the 5th round. And they took John Marino in the 6th round. And we'll get to that later on. Now, there's a couple more deals here down the pipeline with the Penguins. They made that deal for David Perron, right? They also would make a deal at the trade deadline in 2016. The Oilers had actually had a pretty not terrible season, and again, it wasn't where they wanted to be because it wasn't their playoff success year, and we'll get there. They're getting closer to that, but they weren't there yet. It was a sell time once again for the Oilers. They sent Justin Schultz to the Pittsburgh Penguins for a third-round pick, and that was a tough blow for the Oilers because this was a guy that ended up becoming really good in Pittsburgh, helped them win 2 Stanley Cups, back-to-back Cups, is now in Washington. He's put together a really nice career, did Justin Schultz, so that one kind of hurt. So now you look at, they now trade Teddy Purcell. That same day they traded out Justin Schultz, they sent Teddy Purcell to the Florida Panthers for a third-round pick. That was the end of the Teddy Purcell era in Edmonton. It didn't really last long. And now we get to the 2016-17 season, where we get to 2016, and this was pretty big for the Oilers. Again, now this is going into their 10th straight season of missing playoff hockey. 10 straight years of the Oilers missing the postseason. That did not go over well for the fan base. They were getting quite desperate to get back to the Stanley Cup playoffs, and things got interesting in the summer of 2016. So this is the day where we saw the big PK Subban for Shea Weber trade between the Nashville Predators and the Montreal Canadiens. We also saw that same day on June 29th of 2016, the Edmonton Oilers finally trade out that 2010 first overall pick, their first overall pick in franchise history. Taylor Hall getting traded to the New Jersey Devils for a defenseman by the name of Adam Larsson. Adam Larsson was, I believe, a 6th or 7th overall pick in that same draft, and things did not really work for the Oilers. That was a really bad trade. Taylor Hall in 2018 ended up winning the Hart Trophy for MVP of the NHL, leading the Devils to the Stanley Cup playoffs. But that's how things ended with the Oilers. Not a great trade there for Peter Chiarelli. And Adam Larsson, he ended up going to the Seattle Kraken this year, and decided not to re-sign in Edmonton. I never think he was able to get that stink, and I don't have a better word for it. He was never able to rattle the stink of that trade with the 1-for-1 for Hall and Larsson, and I think he just wanted out of Edmonton at that point. So now we get to the 2016 NHL Draft, and just after taking Connor McDavid first overall the year prior, they have the 4th overall pick in this year's draft in 2016. They take with the 4th overall pick Jesse Puljujarvi, who at the time had fallen into their lap. The 1st overall pick was Austin Matthews. The 2nd overall pick was Patrick Laine. And kind of shocking the hockey universe, the Columbus Blue Jackets' Jarmo Kekalainen took 3rd overall. He took, from the Cape Breton Screaming Eagles, he took Pierre-Luc Dubois, kind of an off-the-board pick at number 3, and Jesse Puljujarvi went at number 4 to the Oilers. They also took, in the 2nd round, they took Tyler Benson, who was supposed to be a pretty good prospect, and we're seeing that kind of not work out for the Oilers to this day. But again, that season they had hit only 70 points. It was not a successful season in 2015-2016 for the Oilers. Quick little break here. All right, so now this is the turnaround point for the Edmonton Oilers. And to be honest, this is where they kind of turned the tide from those consecutive top 5 draft picks, really 1st overall picks, to now becoming a legitimate team. As in the 2016-2017 season, or the 2016-2017 NHL season, the Oilers finally get their wish. As the Edmonton Oilers, as well, they made this trade. They moved out Taylor Hall. Later on in October 7th of 2016, it was clear things weren't working out with their other prospect, Nail Yakupov. Other guys had started to take over these 1st overall picks in the depth chart. So in the same year that Taylor Hall was traded out to the New Jersey Devils, Nail Yakupov, another 1st overall pick, sent to the St. Louis Blues for a 2nd round pick and a depth player. That's all Nail Yakupov was worth just a few years after his draft. 4 seasons, 4 years, after being selected first overall. Yakupov to the Blues for a second-round pick. And that was kind of it for Nail. Nail Yakupov had pretty much, no pun intended, put the nail in the coffin for his NHL career. He had left the Blues. He actually signed a PTO with the Avalanche, and that was the final destination for Yak. And he would play in Europe, from that point forward, and that was it for Yakupov. So, two of their three, consecutive first overall picks were out of the organization within 4 years. So that was tough for the Oilers. But the good news out of all of that, so despite two trades that you were thinking, yeah, that kind of sucks, in the 2016-17 season, the Oilers had reached 100 points for the first time in the 2000s. They hit 103 points, and the Oilers, for the first time in 11 seasons, were going to be going to the NHL's Stanley Cup playoffs. And not only did they win that first round series, they actually went to the second round. They ultimately lost in the second round in 6 games to the Anaheim Ducks. But that was a very good turning point for the Oilers. Cam Talbot had an incredible season for the Oilers. Connor McDavid was becoming his player that he is today. That was Leon Draisaitl's first NHL season. We're seeing the Oilers really turning to the team that everybody was finally waiting for. But unfortunately, the heightened expectations going into 2017-18 were definitely tempered down, because once again, the Oilers have another bad season. The 2017-18 season, the Oilers missed the playoffs again. They finished the season with 78 points, which again, you look at 78 compared to 103, it's a 26-point gap there, and really frustrating again for the Oilers. And this is another season where we see some change for the Oilers, as throughout that summer, they allowed Peter Chiarelli to stick around. June 22nd of 2017, the Edmonton Oilers make another trade, trading another former first-round pick, trading Jordan Eberle to the New York Islanders in order to gain some cap space for them. They move on $6 million of cap space in order to bring in Ryan Strome for the Islanders, who was another former first-round draft pick. He was actually selected 6th overall by the Islanders, and at the time kind of looked like a good trade for the Oilers. But Islanders fans knew what they got from Ryan Strome, and they knew what Jordan Eberle was. Oilers fans, within a year or two, realized that was a bad move. It took Ryan Strome, I think, almost like 20 or 30 games to pick up his first goal with the Oilers, and he never got a fair shake in Edmonton. The Oilers would make some more trades with him. They would later trade Ryan Strome to the New York Rangers for Ryan Spooner, and you end up looking at it, they end up trading Ryan Spooner for Sam Gagner, who, remember Sam Gagner from the 2008 NHL draft or something like that? Kind of how things kind of turn out, right? And Toby Reeder comes back to the Oilers at some point here. The management actually called out Toby Reeder, saying that he's a bad player and he doesn't work hard. This was a 4th-round pick from 2006, 2007, and he comes back to Edmonton, and that's how they treated him. It's absolutely awful. So we go to the 2017 NHL Draft, and this is pretty much it for Peter Chiarelli. This is the last moves he would make in Edmonton. With the 22nd pick, they would take Kailer Yamamoto, who was a really good player and one of the first Asian Pacific players drafted or something like that. They took, in the 3rd round, they took goaltender Stuart Skinner, who was a kind of a 3rd or 4th goalie for the Oilers here in 2022. And they also took defenseman Dmitry Samorukov, who has actually looked like a pretty good prospect for the Oilers and is actually playing meaningful minutes in the top 6 for the Oilers blue line. So those guys are still kicking around today. So that actually wasn't a terrible draft for the Oilers. Now that summer, this is where things kind of ended for the Oilers, as the Edmonton Oilers, after a weird move where the Oilers bring in Milan Lucic, gave him an exorbitant amount of money to protect Connor McDavid. McDavid was getting pushed around as a young player, so they figured, let's give $7 million to Milan Lucic. And that's where the ownership and the fan base kind of said, yeah, that's it. That's it for Peter Chiarelli. That was the final nail in the coffin between the Hall trade, him winning the Hart Trophy that year, and Jeff Petrie becoming a top four defenseman in Montreal, Justin Schultz becoming a good player in Pittsburgh. At the end of this video, we're going to go over the results of some of those guys. David Perron, a good top six player, They gave those guys up for pretty much a bag of pucks. So Peter Chiarelli is fired in the summer of 2017, and this name may sound familiar. The brother of Wayne Gretzky, who has been in the organization for all this time, Keith Gretzky, named the interim tag on the general manager position for the Edmonton Oilers. Now, the Edmonton Oilers 2017-18 season would not be followed up by a great 2018-2019 season, as they would finish with 79 points, missing the playoffs again, and another season that everyone now in the papers is saying wasted potential with Connor McDavid. Gone are the days where they're talking about Nail Yakupov or Taylor Hall or Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. He's still a really good player there, and he's probably going to get I believe did he get a payday yet from the Oilers? I don't even remember. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is still a member of the Oilers to this day. Now the talk is about McDavid and Leon Draisaitl, who are the consecutive back-to-back picks in 2014 and 2015. But like I said, 79 points in that 2018-19 season. In the 2018 NHL Draft, they select 10th overall pick defenseman Evan Bouchard, still a member of the Oilers organization to this day. Now we get to the 2019-2020 season, and we know what happened in 2020. Looking back now in 2022, we're still suffering from those same things that happened in the beginning of 2020. So really tough year for just everybody. I think everybody would agree with me on that. The 2019-2020 season was shut short. The Edmonton Oilers had 11 games left to play that season. It was a 71-game season for the Oilers. It was shut down because of the coronavirus, COVID-19 coming into effect probably in the end of mid-January, early February was where things kind of took off. And that was the year where we saw the Oilers decide that spring Steve Yzerman was pretty much the heir to the throne in Detroit as the next general manager in Detroit. That was the Oilers fantasy, the Red Wings fantasy, the protege, the prophecy in Detroit, as Ken Holland was pretty much, made the director of hockey operations, pretty much taken away his general manager duties in order to bring in Steve Yzerman. And Ken Holland's competitive nature led him to become the next general manager of the Edmonton Oilers, where he sits today. And Ken Holland becomes the next general manager in 2019. So in that 2019 NHL draft, the Oilers select 8th overall pick. Another Swedish defenseman. They take Philip Broberg, who we saw a little bit in training camp this year in the preseason. He will probably get more of a shot with the Oilers at the end of this year, come playoff time and stuff, and depending on how things go for the Oilers here in 2022 in their quest to make the playoffs, it's not looked too great. But Philip Broberg might see some NHL ice time as he's developing right now in the American Hockey League. Now, just 2 years after signing Milan Lucic to that massive 6-year, $7 million per year contract, the Edmonton Oilers make a deal with their crosstown rivals in Alberta, the Calgary Flames, trading Milan Lucic to the Calgary Flames for James Neal. James Neal didn't have a great contract either, but at the time it looked like a pretty good trade for the Calgary Flames, as people had saw Lucic as a power forward guy but he couldn't score. Neal had more of that aggressiveness, but he could score goals too. He played very well with the Pittsburgh Penguins, was a really great player for the Nashville Predators, and ultimately the Calgary Flames, where he signed. But now he was a member of the Edmonton Oilers, and that didn't really pan out too well. We know where James Neal is today. He got a PTO with the St. Louis Blues, and things have kind of fallen through. And that is like recent development here at the start of 2022. Now, just a week after that 2019 trade, in July, they made another trade, and this one kind of seemed like an under-the-radar trade. Nobody really talked about it, but you've seen this before. They traded Jeff Petrie to the Montreal Canadiens, becomes a top-pairing defenseman in Montreal. Justin Schultz goes to the Pittsburgh Penguins, becomes a top-pairing defenseman in Pittsburgh. And now the next tale. John Marino, who was a 6th-round draft pick, or 7th-round draft pick of the Edmonton Oilers just a couple of seasons prior, back in 2015, a 6th-round draft pick in 2015. He gets traded out for a 7th-round pick to the Pittsburgh Penguins, where he is now definitely a top 4 defenseman in Pittsburgh, probably the next Chris Letang in Pittsburgh. They traded him for a 7th-round pick. Really not, again, bad asset management. You can't blame just one general manager. This is 3 different general managers making these moves. Trading out David Perron, a top 6 forward. Jeff Petrie to the Montreal Canadiens, top pairing defenseman. Justin Schultz, a top pairing defenseman in Pittsburgh. John Marino, a potential top pairing defenseman in Pittsburgh. It makes you want to pull your hair out, some of the moves the Oilers have made. Again, that's just bad scouting. Now, again, they finished that season, 71 games played, 83 points. And, again, you're just wondering, like, what the hell happened in 2020? They did get a chance at making the playoffs. They got put up against the rebuilding at the time now Chicago Blackhawks. And they did not fare well in that series. They ended up losing that qualifier series to make the playoffs. So they didn't technically make the playoffs in the 2020 playoff bubble. They did not technically make the playoffs that year. They were not one of the last 16 teams in the NHL. Just to add more injury, more salt in the wound for the Oilers. And now we lead to the 2020-21 season, which was really the 2021 season. There were no actual games in 2020 for that campaign. It was another shortened year. It was a 56-game season. They had 73 points that year. And again, they made the playoffs, but they get swept by the Winnipeg Jets in the first round. And they were favored to win that series. They had won the Pacific Division in 2021, and that's how it ended up. Actually, that was the Canadian Division. My bad. So in 2020, they have another top 15 draft pick. With the 14th overall pick, they take from the Big Ten's Wisconsin Badgers centerman Dylan Holloway, a really good prospect, and we're expecting him to come up to Edmonton again. He's been playing with the Bakersfield Condors, potentially between this year and next year. And now we have the 2021-22 season where the Oilers are at today. Now, during the oil change, I have a couple of oil change stats for you, and this is really depressing, if I'm going to be honest. You look at the 15 years that we just went over in 45 minutes here. If you've stuck around this long, I definitely appreciate it. I just feel air in my head right now because I've been talking so much. But from 2010 to 2012, the Edmonton Oilers had 3 straight number 1 draft picks. The NHL had never seen that before. They took Taylor Hall in 2010, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins in 2011, and Nail Yakupov in 2012. 2 of those 3 players are no longer a part of the Oilers organization, which, again, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, who is really the third-line center for the Oilers now, again, the first overall pick back then, he's the third-line center behind Draisaitl and McDavid. Some more first overall stats for you. They had the first overall pick. They had 4 first overall picks in 6 seasons. So like I said, in 2010, Taylor Hall. 2011, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. 2012, they took Nail Yakupov. In 2014, they took a break. They decided to go with, Darnell Nurse and then Leon Draisaitl. And they went back to Connor McDavid again. 4 first overall picks in 6 seasons. You can't make this up. More top 5 draft picks. So they had 6 top 5 draft picks in 7 years. So in 6 of those 7 years, a top 5 draft pick. That was Taylor Hall first overall, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins first overall, Nail Yakupov first overall, Leon Draisaitl third overall, Connor McDavid first overall, and Jesse Puljujarvi fourth overall. The only guy that wasn't drafted in the top 5 was at number 7, which was Darnell Nurse in 2012. Okay. Some more unflattering stats. So from 2006 up until today, here in 2022, they have had 5 different general managers. They have had Kevin Lowe, Steve Tambellini, Craig McTavish, Peter Chiarelli, and Ken Holland. 5 different general managers. Now, here's another unflattering stat. They have missed the playoffs 10 straight seasons in that stretch between 2007 and 2016. And they have technically, in the last couple of years, since 2006, they have made the playoffs in 15 seasons. They've made the playoffs technically twice. And if you want to include the playoff bubble where they lost in 4 games to the Chicago Blackhawks and got spanked, technically they made it to the postseason 3 times. They made it to the official playoffs twice in 15 years. Twice. And they only won 1 playoff round throughout that entire time as well. So in 15 years, they won 1 playoff round. They got swept in 2021. So this is recent times the Oilers have gotten their butts kicked. Not only back in those 3 consecutive first overall picks, today they are still getting their butts kicked. And this is some more just no consistency and no real structure or credibility. In those 15 years, they have only hit the 40-plus win mark twice, which basically means 80-plus wins per season. Because, let's be honest, every 2 points, that's 40 wins, around 80 points. They've only done that twice in the past 15 years throughout the oil change era. And to make things even more concerning, there was only one time in the oil change era that the Edmonton Oilers hit 100-plus points, and that was the 2016-2017 season, the golden era of the Oilers, which only lasted 1 season with Cam Talbot as the starter. They hit 103 points, winning the Pacific Division. Again, they won that first-round series and ultimately lost in the second round. They hit the 100-plus point mark 1 season in 15 years. That's all the information for you. A 15-year timeline of the Edmonton Oilers. It was rough. It was rough watching the Edmonton Oilers. And, I can only imagine how Oilers fans, if you're the older Oilers fans who remember the success they had in the mid-'80s and early '90s, compared to where they are today, it is so frustrating. And you look at that, that timeline, again, the 3 consecutive first overall picks. After that draft pick with Nail Yakupov, the NHL said, we can't keep doing this. They're going to have 6 or 7 straight first overall picks. Because at the end of the day, you could have 10 years of the first overall pick. But if you don't have good coaching, good management, and good leadership in the locker room, it doesn't matter what you do with that. And maybe to some extent, it's a good thing that this happened. Because general managers have learned from this. You can't just have, the bachelor party, the fraternity running your locker room. You look at all the young guys who were on this team. This was a team that was extremely young, inexperienced, and unfortunately it stunted the growth of these younger players. And who knows? And this is no discredit to what these guys are, but we never saw the full potential of these players. I'm just going to name a couple of them for you that were still with the organization and probably faltered their development in their time with the Oilers. Sam Gagner, Linus Ullmark, Jordan Eberle, Magnus Pajärvi-Svensson, Taylor Hall, Tyler Pitlick, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. Oscar Klefbom's a pretty good player, but Oscar Klefbom, Nail Yakupov, Darnell Nurse, Anton Slepyshev, David Perron, Sean Horkoff. Let's take a look. Let's find some more. Griffin Reinhart. But you could argue Jesse Pujärvi most recently. Who else we got? Probably Jesse Pujärvi is the latest example that we could look at. Okay? Those are guys that probably had their potential stunted at Edmonton. Now let's look at the guys that left Edmonton and the success they had and some really bad trades they made. Chris Pronger, he ended up winning a Stanley Cup with the Anaheim Ducks the season he left the Oilers. Let's take a look. Dustin Penner, he won 2 Stanley Cups in 3 years with the Los Angeles Kings when he got traded from them in 2011. Andrew Cogliano became one of the they call it the Iron Man streak for most games played consecutively in an NHL career. That was Andrew Cogliano. That was one of the longest in NHL history. Toby Reeder became a pretty good middle six player in the NHL. Sean Horkoff ended up being a really good player in Dallas and led to some really good successful seasons there. He was the captain of the Oilers when he left. They traded David Perron, a guy they had acquired. They had acquired the talent, then ultimately traded it to Pittsburgh. He became a really good top 6 winger in the NHL. They traded Devin Dubnyk, who is a starter, who became a really good starter with the Minnesota Wild, had a very successful NHL career. Alej Hemsky, probably another guy that got stunted. They traded Sam Gagner out. Like I said, they traded David Perron. They traded Justin Schultz to the Pittsburgh Penguins. He is a top pairing defenseman in his prime when he was there, and he won two back-to-back cups with the Pittsburgh Penguins. Taylor Hall led the New Jersey Devils to the playoffs after a couple of years of drought for them. Really successful there. Jordan Eberle, he went to the Eastern Conference Finals in 2 consecutive seasons in his tenure with the New York Islanders. Another really successful time for him. John Marino, the latest example of this. John Marino went to the Penguins for a 7th-round pick. He was nominated as one of the rookies of the year back in 2019-2020. These are guys that the Oilers had. But you could argue if they stayed in the organization, they wouldn't have ever developed like the guys that did stay. There's something in Edmonton. And I've made this video before with the Buffalo Sabres. There's something in the water in Buffalo and in Edmonton. And it's culture. It's the culture of this organization. You could change the general manager. You could change the players. You could do whatever. There is a fundamental issue with this organization, and I can't figure it out. I don't know what to tell you, Oilers fans. It's been really difficult. And you look at some of the stats I said earlier in this video. It's been rough for the Oilers fans out there. And I truly understand the frustration because this is just one of the pinnacle examples of a failed rebuild. A rebuild that was rushed. A rebuild that didn't have leadership and veterans around the young guys developing. And ultimately, they had to start all over again from square one. And let's be honest. Honestly, if the Edmonton Oilers today did not have Leon Draisaitl and Connor McDavid in consecutive drafts, honestly, where would the Edmonton Oilers be today? Today, here in 2022. So guys, that is it for today's video. I figured I'd let you guys think about that. If you like what we're doing here at Goal Line Hockey, want to see the latest news around the NHL and more videos just like this one, you guys know what to do. Make sure to give this video a big thumbs up and an even bigger subscribe down below. Guys, as always, thank you so much for watching. I will see you again next time.